Today's lesson will be on switch statements. Switch statements are another type of control structure that allow you to make decisions similar to if statements. An if statement is a single selection structure, whereas an if else is a double selection structure. Switches are a multiple selection structure. An if statement is a single selection structure, and an if else statement is a double selection structure. But what if you have something that could have more than two options? In that particular case, a switch is a better alternative. You can always do a bunch of if else statements nested together, but the problem is that you're more likely, it's harder to read, you're more likely to have dangling else situations, and it just can be messy. So having a switch statement is a really nice option that's available to us with Java. And so in this particular, in a situation where you would have multiple selections, a switch statement is a nice option. Switches test a variable for numerous possibilities instead of just one or two. So let's look at it. We'll be looking at an example of that shortly. Okay. Before we get into the example of the switch statement, I just want to do a really very quick review of the char data type, which is the character data type. The thing to remember about character data types is that if you identify a number as a character and not as a number data type, like a float or a double or an int, you no longer treat that number as a number value. Instead, you would be treating it as a character, and therefore you would not be able to use it in any calculations. So that's just something to remember, that you wouldn't be able to use any sort of arithmetic if you use a number and identify it as a character. Why you might want a number identified as a character would be like if the number was representative of an address, or if the number was an ID number. In that particular case, you would never be doing calculations with it, and you wouldn't want it to potentially change into some weird calculation. So in that case, you might want to label it, establish that it's a character data type instead of an int or a double or something like that. Now, here we've got an example of a particular piece of code that basically what it does here is, if you read through this and look at it, it basically says that if a person, so it asks a person to enter a character to test, and what they're looking for is they're looking to determine if the character that the person entered is a vowel. And so you'll see here, in this line right here, you see that they're testing to see if the character entered is either a small a or a capital A. And if it is one of those two options, then the computer program would cause it to print out that whatever character they put in, assume it's a little a, then the little a is a vowel. And it does the same thing, as you can see, it does the same thing for the rest of these here. And then the very last statement here in the else says, okay, the character that the person entered was not a vowel at all. So you can see it's not terrible because there's only 10 options here. But if you had more than that, it could really get ugly fast. And you can see that it would be challenging to keep track of which else's go with which ifs, etc., etc. So there is a better way to do that. And the example that we have next, coming up next, is an example of how you would do this exact same code, but using a switch statement instead. So here you see the same program. Again, we're asking, the user is asking to, is being prompted to enter a vowel or a character that will be tested to determine whether or not it's a vowel. Here's where the switch statement begins, here at line 8. And what you see happening is the switch is fed the input, and the input value is CH. I would have put character myself, but this came from the university. So I would have put character because it's more clear. Input character probably would be the best variable name in this particular case. But the programmer that set this up just put CH. So this is the input value. I'm going to then test it amongst the cases listed from line 9 through line 13. So line 9 basically says if the character that was entered was either the little a or the capital A, then I would come down here to line 14 and I would print this statement. So what happens is the computer goes and takes the character that was entered. So let's say in this case, the character that was entered was a capital I. Okay, so if we put in a capital I into this program, it's going to look, it does not meet the first case. It does not meet the E cases, but it does meet the I case. So in that case, what it's going to do is it's going to come down here and it would print out capital I is a vowel. And then break, which means that it would exit out of the switch statement. It would end the switch statement, so it would come down to line 19 and then end the main method and end the class. Now, let's assume that the next time they input a Z. Okay? And in this case, what will happen is it will check and it notices that none of these cases are true. And so since none of these cases are true, it would then, the program would move into line 16. At line 16, it would say it did not match any of the cases that I have. So in that case, it would send me then to line 17, and it would print out Z is not a vowel. And then again, there's a break. So that exits me out of the switch statement and into line 19 and then to line 20 and 21. So that would end the program. Here you see another example. In this particular example, they're still testing a character. They're testing to see whether or not it is indeed a lowercase vowel this time. And so again, you see that it is checking the various different cases. And then if it doesn't match any of those cases, the default would get triggered and it would print out that it's not a vowel. So again, this is very similar to the example that you just looked at. Same exact situation and scenario. They're going to compare the different cases. If it doesn't meet any of if it meets the case, it will print out line 4. It will execute line 14. If not, it will skip down to line 16 and execute that and then end the program. Okay, here we've got a third example of a switch statement. In this particular case, if we go through, we look, the first line of code imports the util scanner so that we can actually provide user input. The next line defines the class. So the name of our class is switch demo 3. We set up our main method in line 3. We create our variable. We create our scanner object, actually. Our scanner object, not our variable. our scanner object so that we can read something in. Then in line 6, or line 5, we prompt the user to enter a number. Line 6, we identify that the variable the variable name that will be used for the user input is foo. I'm not sure what they were thinking there, but that's what we're, so in line 7, they're assigning the variable foo to be whatever the user entered, which is what's happening in line 7. In line 8, they're feeding in the foo variable into the switch statement so that they can compare it amongst the cases. If the person entered 1, then the system would print out you entered a 1. If you type in a 4, the system would print out you entered a 4. If the person typed either the number 9 or the number 17, it would print out 9 or 17. If the user entered 2112, then the computer would print out a cool number. If the user put in any other number, so say the user put in -5. If the user inputs -5, then it would print what? Okay, so let's see. In this example, we have another example of a switch. Now, the one thing that I didn't mention before was I didn't really talk about the break and what happens with the break. In this particular example, what they're looking at is they're trying to determine if the user is going to input some type of operator, and the computer then has to determine what the operator is and what the characters are that the person entered so that it can make the calculation for a simple expression, either addition, multiplication, division, or subtraction. And if it's not something that it knows, like maybe the person tried to enter x caret 3, x raised to the 3 power, or something like that, then the computer isn't going to be able to do that. And so in that case, it would go down to the default. But let's say that the user enters 3 times 4. So in that case, what the computer is going to do is it's going to take the information that the user entered, and it's going to first print out 3 times 4 equals, and then it's going to have to get this information that is needed for this right here. In order to get that information, in order to get that information, we have to go down to enter the switch. So within the switch, we're looking at the operator, and the operator in this particular case is the multiplication symbol. So when you look, it's checking the first case. Since that case is not true, then it's going to go down to check the next case. Since that case, the case on line 17, is also not true, it's going to jump down to, looks like about line 19. At line 19, this case is true. So in that particular case, it's going to go ahead and complete the calculation, and then it hits the break. So here is where I would actually print the value. So now it would actually cause the computer to print. So this is what would be output at this point. The break causes it to exit the switch statement. And so in that case, it would take us down to line 27. Now, if the user had entered this information, like we had mentioned before, in this case, this caret operator is not an operator that is of choice here. So in that case, it would go to the default and it would have print out unknown value. So, but at the same time, if the user had entered, say, 1 plus 1, then what would have happened is as it entered the switch, it would have happened upon the very first case. And so it would have printed out right away 1 plus 1 equals 2. And then it would have exited, because of the break here, it would have exited the switch statement. In the previous examples that we had looked at, there was no break. So it would check, even though it had already found a possible answer, if maybe the person had entered A and it discovered right away that A is a vowel, it still would have, because it didn't have a break, it still would have checked to see if it was an E, an I, an O, or a U. So the break is important, and the break can help to improve the speed of the program because it allows it to skip certain cases, and you wouldn't have to necessarily execute each and every single case that was possible. As soon as it found its answer, if there was only one choice, then it would be able to exit the switch statement immediately. Okay, in this particular example, it's asking the user to type in a number between 1 and 5 to see how many times you want to print out the phrase hello world. If the user were to enter a value of 3, then it's going to test, and it first tests, is the Z equal to 5? No, it's not, so it's not going to execute line 10. So it comes down to line 11. It's not equal to 4, so it's not going to execute line 12. It is equal to 3, so it's going to print out that line, hello world. It doesn't break. The system doesn't, there's no break at this point, so it's going to continue to check these other two statements until it gets to the break. And at that point, then it would finally exit the program. If you entered a number that was too big, or a number that was, like if you entered 6, you would hit the default. If you entered a negative value, like a -3, again, you would get the default. So you need to, in this particular case, it would go through and it would check for sure how many times, and it would execute. As I said, it's going to continue to execute each line until you have either hit a break or until you've exited the switch. Switches versus if and if else's. If and if else's can test ranges of numbers using relational and inequality operators. Switch statements can only make exact matches. So there are some limitations to the switch statement. If and if else can test data types other than just int and characters, such as floating point numbers. If and if else can find one condition to be true and execute a particular action, whereas switch statements find one match and continue executing the code until a break is found. So, you know, there are some times when switch is going to save you some time, and then there's other times when a switch isn't going to work and you really have no other choice other than to use if and if else statements and possibly nest them together. That's where it's going to be very important that you use proper indentation, proper documentation, and proper blocking of your code by use of braces, etc., so that you can clearly identify what goes with what and you don't create any dangling else structures.